Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Jaco van Zyl, who is a South African clinical psychologist who is recently, or a couple years ago, moved up to Ireland. And in this conversation, we talk about psychology and sociology and their interrelation, specifically with the victim culture that is promoted by critical social justice, aka wokeness, and how that is a replacement in the West of dignity culture, and how the dynamics of guilt, repression, tolerance, and shame form a potent cocktail that's quite toxic for human flourishing, both on a personal and a social level. This is a wonderful, deep conversation. It really gets my gears a-grindin' in a good way, though we're talking about really deep personal things. It's also just really fun to tackle these human aspects of the so-called culture war. Jaco is also the co-host of the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast. Critical Therapy Antidote is a group of professionals who are concerned about the encroachment of social justice ideology into the counseling profession. And if you are a professional and want to join that organization, or if you're just more interested in topics such as we cover today, links are down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Jaco van Zyl. How you been? How was your summer?
We had the wettest July in recorded history.
Oh,
How's that
wettest.
for fun?
Huh.
Yeah. So we didn't have much of a summer, apparently, but I actually enjoyed the summer very much. I don't know why. It was different from last year's summer. It's possibly just my experience of it. Last year, we had just come over to Ireland. Many things were new. The adjustment was still fresh and still a bit difficult. But this year has been different. I've really been appreciating the summer much more. I've been out much more. And I also started a hobby, beekeeping, which is also...
Wow.
Yeah, crazy. I know. Yeah, it's possible to do that. My cousin's a beekeeper in South Africa on the KwaZulu-Natal south coast. So she actually introduced the idea in my mind, and I thought maybe I should just explore it. But in South Africa, it was difficult because we stayed in the city, and finding land or finding space to put your beehives can be quite difficult. Safety would be one of the concerns. But here in Ireland, it's not a problem. So one of our friends said they've open land. They don't plant anything there because it's boggy and there's just heather growing there. So I took up the offer and decided to do the beekeeping.
I guess they come in hives, right? So how many hives do you have going?
Only two boxes. Okay. Yeah.
All right. And they go on don't they hibernate during the winter? So they kind of just...
They do. But fortunately here in Ireland, it doesn't get that cold. So we just feed them for, say, December, January, February. And then March, when the gorse, it's a spiny shrub with yellow flowers, about 1.5 meters, 2 meters tall. Then when they start flowering, then the bees start looking after themselves again.
You grew up in South Africa completely?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What's the different feeling? Like, I guess this than the climate, or just the feeling of these two completely different places on the earth? Ireland.
The climate would be the one. We are noticing a starker contrast in seasons. The coldest season the coolest season would obviously be longer than the warmer season, and also the length of days and nights. It's strange to us to wake up early in the morning, say around 4:00, and we see that it's already light. Okay, but in South Africa, daybreak would be early as well, but sunset would be at the latest, say 7:00, whereas here in the northern hemisphere, this far north, it would be around 10:30 p.m., which is still strange to us.
Yeah, I have to actually look at a map.
But yeah,
Because I always just imagine South Africa being roughly equivalent to Europe in what latitude is it?
Mm. No, it's so Europe, where we find ourselves. We're farther north from, so the Cancer Tropic, the Tropic of Cancer, than when where we stayed in South Africa, removed from the Tropic of Capricorn. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're farther north than we were south.
Yeah, I guess South Africa.
It's wetter, yeah.
Huge amount of distance between you and the next body of land, the Antarctic, right? That mystery zone down there.
Madagascar, maybe.
Oh yeah. Did you do a lot of traveling through Africa, or I mean, that's such a huge continent.
Yeah. No, not really. Mozambique a bit, and we went to Zanzibar, but not really to the other Southern African countries. We travel quite a bit in South Africa itself. It's quite vast and quite diverse biomes and geographies. So that's been about it. So in terms of climate, we recognize the difference. The wetness is maybe a bit of a problem to some of the South Africans. I like the wetness. Maybe I still have this sentiment around rain being the blessing from above. And so from a climate perspective, that is what we find. From a social perspective, it is interesting to experience the safety, the openness, the freedom of movement, not being scared of being mugged, being attacked, not looking over your shoulder all the time. Even when you're out in the open, out in the field, not being worried that someone might be hiding behind a bush, ambushing you, things like that.
Yeah.
So that is quite different here in Ireland. And I have found, though, that, and this is understandable given the Irish history and given the functionality in the Irish society in terms of infrastructure, systems working, etc., that the Irish tend to be rather forgiving of the politicians. I'd rather, what shall I say, rather trusting of their politicians. Whereas in South Africa, I think we have a greater suspicion for our politicians. Again, given our history, older and more recent history.
Is that sustainable? Just the instability on a sociological level? Like everybody's just on
in South Africa?
Pins and needles, in South Africa. And
I don't think so, no. What they're creating is, again, new type of intergenerational trauma. And I think we're going to see way more, what shall I call it, explosions in terms of behavioral acting out in masses because of the state of threat South African society finds itself in constantly.
To what degree did that inform your move from South Africa?
It did, to a large extent. We stayed in a very nice place in a relatively safe area, but we gradually saw the encroachment into our neighborhood of criminal activity. And I remember coming over to Ireland the first few months that I noticed how deep my sleep was. While in South Africa, we were alert all the time. Any sound, whether it's a cat on the roof or a bird flying, crashing into a window, that would alert us. And we would wonder what the hell is going on. So yeah, to a large extent, the safety and the deterioration of society informed our move, which was painful. I have a fondness towards South Africa and of the people in South Africa. My background was rather mixed in terms of my exposure to different different, even African people, the African nation, tribes, I would say, the Pedi tribe in particular toward the north of South Africa. So that is something else that I miss. I miss the sound of African language here in Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot
and
of
African food.
different foods, but the languages, there wasn't just like one or two dialects, but there was multiple languages. Yeah. Huh. And now you're just surrounded by English speakers. Irish English speakers, though, at least.
Irish English with an interesting accent.
Yeah.
Interesting expressions. Yeah. But I really enjoy it. I really, really enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's a good country.
Yeah. Are you just saying that for the immigration board to look back on?
No, I'm not like that.
Okay.
Not in the least.
Something that's been popping up in my conversations lately, when somebody comes on my channel and we talk about their lived experience, and especially around gender dysphoria, gender distress, there ends up, if they go through a process of really deeply looking at themselves, they eventually see that there's some sort of trauma that's associated with their gender confusion or gender difficulties, or using gender to work through trauma in one way or another. And then one term that comes up increasingly is this, and I have a problem with psychology because it has all these terms that become things in themselves rather than descriptors, right? Complex post-traumatic stress syndrome, where you're under constant alert. Maybe your hypothalamus, there's some sort of brain thing that can be measured scientifically. What do you think about that complex post-traumatic stress disorder syndrome?
Yeah, so we have this understanding in psychology that if trauma doesn't get processed sufficiently and in time, it gets generalized. So generalized trauma goes and sits in your body, and obviously it sits in your body as a reflection of what's happening in the brain, that as the source of control over those body parts. So the idea of complex PTSD sounds interesting, and I think there is validity, and it can be quite a helpful idea. There's also been a proposal that borderline personality disorder and its similarities to complex PTSD might suggest or might indicate that borderline personality disorder could be just complex PTSD, although there are some researchers who would say that no, there are sufficient distinctions between the two syndromes or the two presentations. Be that as it may, I think it can be helpful. My problem is not necessarily with the idea of complex PTSD. My problem is around this whole society of psychological obsession that everything is traumatic these days. You don't hear that people went through a period of severe discomfort. They went through a period of trauma. Our move here to Ireland, I described it as adjustment. Some people might describe it as traumatic. And it's got something to do with the removal of one of the criteria of PTSD from the DSM, from DSM-4 to DSM-5. One of the criteria was where a person experienced or had an experience where they perceived a threat or imminent threat to their state of survival. Now, a threat of their state of survival, a threat to their life, is no longer a criterion for PTSD. That has been removed. And that opened up this possibility of describing anything that was quite difficult or extended, required the person to extend or exert themselves more fully to be considered as traumatic. And I think it's got something to do with the development within our society from what the sociologists Campbell and Manning described, from a dignity society to a victimhood society, where the fragility of the individual is assumed, and people relate to the individual from a state of fragility, or with that assumption or bias that the individual is fragile, the individual is more vulnerable than we imagine they are. And I think that just enhanced this narrative and this discourse of trauma, of suffering, and even slight pieces of discomfort could be considered traumatic.
I was working with some youth. I had a child labor camp going on because I was making some cider. So we employed some boys cutting apples and juicing the apples. And the boy got...
Child labor.
Yeah, child labor. And one of the boys cut his finger. And we wrapped it, we bandaged it up, and then he's like, it's still stinging. He was wondering if there's anything in the apples that making it sting. And he's like, it's just stinging, it's stinging, it's stinging. And the other boy's like, well, you're cut. Of course it's going to sting. And then I came up with the manly thing to say in that situation is, pain is the weakness leaving your body, the kind of the daddy thing. It's like, this is character building. This isn't trauma.
It that way.
Yeah. This is you overcoming something. This is your challenge. This is your hurdle. And spending a lot of time in preschool as a preschool teacher, you come in with kind of a more manly-ish or a masculine way of looking at pain, looking at trauma, looking at like hurt. As opposed to a more feminine or more care-oriented. I'm going to care. I'm going to hug you. I'm going to hold you. I'm going to lift you up. Like I'm like, well, it's your pain. If I impose my body on your body by hugging you, like I'm distracting you from the pain. When if you just confront the pain and look through the pain, say, yeah, I am in pain. That's my pain, and the pain's going to go away. And it kind of establishes a sense of resilience in the kid, but at the same time, the criticism of that method, that masculine method, is that you're detached from it. You're not allowing the kid to cry. You're bottling up their emotions. You're not letting them like go through and experience this thing by saying, okay, we're playing Frisbee. We're not playing crying right now. You didn't get the Frisbee. Try harder, kind of thing.
Yeah. So that is the distinction between what we psychologists, again, with our psychobabble, refer to as the maternal function versus the paternal function. The maternal function is holding, it's nurturing, it's cuddling, it's coddling, it's affirming, mirroring. So the maternal function suggests there is excess, there is fusion, there is relief. That's the maternal function. The paternal function is a bit different. It's challenging, it's interpreting, it's confronting you with reality, it's encouraging you to exert yourself, to put your skills on the line. That's the paternal function. The paradox is the paternal function is necessary so that the child can experience the perpetual presence of the internal mother. Think about it this way: if for that child to be strong and resilient enough to carry themselves through discomfort, they need to have an internal belief that they're able to nurture themselves. And for them to do that, they need to put that to the test. They need to be placed in a state of paternal discomfort so that they can reach into internal available resources and hopefully find the internalized mother that would carry them, nurturing them through the state of distress and exertion. But if that doesn't happen, it's almost as if the child never gets the opportunity to generate and to take the initiative to bring forth the internal nurturer while enduring discomfort.
I want to kind of try to take a leap, so help me out here, or just let me dangle myself over the cliff and fall to my imminent foolish demise. But
No,
if we're
fine.
if we're living in a more and more, I suppose, okay, so there's the dignity culture. I know there's an honor culture, but you were talking about like the victim culture versus the dignity culture. I'm wondering if the victim culture is kind of like the toxic mother, kind of where there's no chance for you to say, no, I can take care of myself. Everybody's always victimizing each other. They're always coddling each other. So it forms a network of always having to be inside. And that's where you have, this is the creaky part. This is where you have more and more group activity, more and more collectivism and identitarianism, because everybody has to be in a group. So we just kind of form these groups, and then we start to, we're fused. Okay. And then I'm wondering, because I know that you're really interested in authoritarianism and certain aspects of groupthink, censorship, that kind of thing. If you have a victim culture where everybody needs to be constantly coddled and protected, then they're always going to be inside, and then they're always fighting for a group. They're not fighting for themselves. They're fighting on behalf of themselves, right? Which works in a demographic kind of way. So if you, if society is going to be a democracy, then it has to have these movements that are always like voting one way or making a choice in this other way. I'm laying out a broader map, going from the personal psychological to the broader kind of sociological level. And if that's some of the things that you're seeing, and insofar as you are concerned about, pop culture or the culture war or whatever like that, if there's like psychological aspects to it that are the path forward towards making the world a little less insane.
You're asking what the path forward is?
This is where I'm dangling a bunch of, I threw a bunch of things for you.
Okay. Yeah, so I referred to the victimhood culture from the dignity culture because the West has been built around the concept of dignity, that the individual has internal dignity, and no matter what the person might be called, what the person with around gossip, being disrespected, etc., there is this internal, or there's this bias in our culture that the person has internal dignity. You can treat the person badly, they're still a dignified human being. That the treatment doesn't necessarily
define their worth.
Define their worth. In severe cases of reputation violation, there are institutions available to remedy that. In serious and severe cases, whereas in an honor culture, even small slights would induce violent retaliation from their side. With a victimhood culture, even small slights would induce the person complaining and seeking help from these larger institutions to fight their battle for them. Hence, this issue around misgendering, for instance, where a person could be fired from work, or they could be dragged in front of a court or a magistrate because of a small slight. The person didn't acknowledge the other person as the way they wanted to be acknowledged. So
so those, just to clarify, so dignity, honor, and victimhood cultures, so-called, are different forms of reputation management. Honor and victimhood culture are very linked in that there's a really tight policing of slight reputation management, like a constant enforcement of slight reputation. And honor culture is either you yourself or your clan, your immediate family, maybe your brother or your father, if you're a woman, enacts the restitution of reputation on behalf of, or enforces that line. In a dignity culture, there's more wiggle room.
Yes.
We don't, like, sticks and stones may break my bones, but reputation damage really doesn't hurt me because I'm bigger and better than that kind of thing.
Yeah. That is also why this woke trend didn't really catch on in traditional dignity cultures, like in the Middle East, Japan, in China, those areas. It's because in honor cultures, those are honor cultures. And it is unthinkable. It's unthinkable that you would use victimhood status as a means to gain reputation. Never.
Okay. Yeah.
You would use achievement and reputation and those types of things that to gain reputation. But victimhood, never. Okay. It's too shameful.
But then why would a dignity culture slide into a victimhood culture? What's the hack?
It's a gradual thing. And I've been thinking about this myself, but it's a gradual thing. This thing developed over several decades. Yeah. Plenty of factors played into this development. And I think some of those factors included things like the prosperity in the West, the redundancy of strong men, people could afford to call their parents, or I say around the 80s, I noticed it, and it's just anecdotal. But South Africa there was a lag between what America produced and what eventually ended up in South Africa. Late 80s, early 90s, heavy censorship was suspended. So the flow of different types of media productions increased into South Africa. And I noticed this tendency of a generation I like to call, I will cuss one time on your channel, the fuck you mom generation.
Oh, okay.
And that's new in South Africa. That was new back then. But it appeared to me that it was quite popular and prominent and even.
Could you just define that? Because is that like your mom is so fat that she needs an Atlas?
Your own parents, where you just zap your own parents, or you're just defiant of your own parents and you do your own thing, and your parents would just tolerate such behavior. That is anathema within this South African culture of all different ethnicities in South Africa. Okay. It was something I noticed. And if you think about it, it's now late 80s, early 90s. It's a generation and a half later. So those people would have grown up with this idea of defiance of authority, that authority is not really necessary, that you can zap that authority and just be what you want, and not really appreciate what previous generations have accomplished, the prosperity that you're now enjoying. And I think it has something to do with society becoming a too good mother. One of my favorite articles, I will explain that to you now. So one of my favorite articles, it was written in 1996 already, is an article by a person called Juliet Hopkins, I think, The Dangers and Deprivations of Too Good Mothering. And I'm using that as almost as a metaphor of what's been happening in the West. And in this article, she goes into some of the theory of a post-Freudian psychoanalyst called Donald Winnicott. And Donald Winnicott has this concept of good enough mothering. So it's a mother that is consistent enough, but fails from time to time. So the infant experiences the failure of mother, but manages to repair that break in fusion. And paradoxically, that creates within the infant an appreciation for mother, because the infant has experienced temporary loss of her. Yeah. And it also creates hope within the infant that even though they may be too aggressive towards mom, or that they may be too angry towards mom, or maybe even too envious of mom, that the infant can still repair that. So the guilt within an infant raised by a good enough mother is reparative guilt. In a neglectful mother, that isn't possible because the mother isn't consistent enough such that the infant can internalize the presence of a persistent or of an always present mother. And such an infant grows up to be very paranoid, many times even psychotic, and in other times even antisocial. What is also bad is when the mother is too good, where the infant does not get in contact or does not experience and survive adequate periods regularly enough, periods of frustration, where the infant just assumes that mom is always there, that my needs predominate. Some of those infants don't even seem to have an awareness of their needs. And they grow up entitled. They cannot handle mistakes. It's almost as if they are being attacked. They go into a paranoid state of dread because they never had the experience of repairing that temporary break and fusion between themselves and the mother. And I get the impression that society, because the society became so prosperous and could tolerate so much misdemeanor from infants or from this newer generations, that those generations have never really experienced loss of that prosperity such that they have adequate appreciation for that. And I think Hannah Arendt actually mentioned it, that a free people, it is impossible for a free people to imagine, even to imagine life under a dictatorship. It is impossible. And I get that. I can see that. Even from a South African perspective, it is impossible to imagine 20 years ago that the country would deteriorate to that extent. It was just not possible in our minds. So to this generation, with several other prosperous generations before them, there's no other world that possibly exists than the prosperous one, and those that do exist are far away. It's purely imaginary. It's never experienced, and because it's not experienced, it doesn't register either as true or as possible. I think because of this, we see this emergence of entitlement, narcissism, this lack of appreciation of their heritage, finding the object or the target of their projecting of their dissatisfaction in the culture or in the society that actually made this prosperity possible. And I mean, an infant encounters frustrations not only because of temporary or, from time to time failures from mom, but also due to existence. There are some existential frustrations too. And we see in these more recent generations that they even want to resent their society for existential frustrations, such as being born in the wrong body. That's a classical example of that. Even biology is wrong. They depict adolescence as maybe this child might go through the wrong adolescence. Imagine that. So adequate decentering, adequate appreciation of the other as necessary to your own existence hasn't happened to many individuals of this generation. So they remain narcissistically centered within themselves, and everything else must be the source of their discomfort, but hardly ever themselves. And I think something else that accelerated this scourge of narcissism was social media not only social media, but also the existence of a virtual world. Because a virtual world opens up virtual possibilities. I mean, you just gave an example of a boy who cut their finger. You cannot experience that in the virtual world, you know. That's part of the problem. They think that because something is possible in the virtual world, it's got to be possible in reality. These people, these children, grew up with technology from a very, very young age. So their worldview and their being in the world is significantly different from those of us who grew up pre-internet.
If society doesn't collapse upon itself one way or another, and we keep electricity going and we keep some sort of food going, and the internet doesn't just disappear, the internet will remain, and people will grow up within the internet. There will be entire cultures, generations upon generations, that interface more through the internet than through any other avenue. Going to the market. I mean, everything's getting more and more set up to, like, we're basically in this kind of spaceship, like where everybody's got like their little capsule, you know? So being in the conversations that I've been in, people bring up the internet. The internet's like, what's this culture war? Like, what are the kids these days? The internet, you know, the internet's the problem, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, maybe we're just going through growing pains. Maybe culture, maybe human beings will adapt. We're incredibly adaptive. I mean, we live anywhere from Cape Town to Siberia, you know? Yeah. We can populate any given thing, and our cultures kind of reflect our the environment that we're in. Even like our mating, like how we perceive of and regulate the sexual function, you know, sexual desire is, you know, it's adorned in different ways across cultures. And I'm sure that has to do in part with just the land that these cultures live in and the animals that are around them and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if you think about pain as being necessary for growth, and if there will be forms of resilience that create strong men or strong resilient characters, maybe in the internet, if that will, you know. And you see that if you kind of just look at these different websites and how they operate. Tumblr, I think, is done now, but there's these kind of Tumblr girls and 4chan boys. And 4chan has this really crass way of just memeing the heck out of everything, and it's very sardonic, very, you know, very removed, and they kind of run towards like offensive language, and it's kind of a cover for other kinds of thoughts. And then there's the Tumblr arenas who are they're always policing each other's language, and there's all these games that they play, you know, it's kind of they're using this zone, this internet, to actually express and develop feelings. And then there's just these really weird kind of phenomena where you have like these really nihilistic men, you have these incels, you have porn addiction over here, and then you have these highly self-obsessed women with like addiction to eating disorders. And then you have the gender thing where they kind of all like end up. You have the transmexing boys, and then the ROGD girls like starting to use this gender thing to deal with their disconnection from the world. I'm throwing a lot out there.
Yeah. So no, I don't consider internet to be a bad thing. I don't consider social media to be a bad thing. Just as I don't consider sugar to be a bad thing. We know, because of the excessive availability of food, that people will use food to excess, and they will develop certain health conditions that will unnecessarily make them suffer. Okay. And what's necessary is not necessary. What's necessary is not to ban sugar necessarily. What is necessary is to get people to use their agency better, and that is to deliberately and intentionally introduce greater scarcity, even though it is available. That is with food. That's with internet. That's with sex. That is with social media, greater agency. The problem with this is the way people respond to unnecessary and artificially induced diseases, such as diseases associated with
obesity
and bad diets.
Okay.
Many times, instead of reducing or managing their diets, they would reactively go for, say, bariatric surgery, while continuing with a bad diet. The same with things like internet use and the bad consequence, especially to youngsters around social media use. Instead of reducing the access to certain social media platforms and internet platforms, instead parents send these youngsters to psychotherapists to cover up, to undo the damage, while back home they continue doing the damage to themselves.
Yeah.
So it is. So the response there is reactive as opposed to restructuring of their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And people are rich enough to do that. That is where Herbert Marcuse's he had a point when he said, technologically, society is so prosperous that we can afford to indulge. We can afford to indulge sexually, in terms of our diets, in terms of what we enjoy, leisure, laziness. We can indulge much, much more because society can afford the damage that would come from such lifestyles. We're seeing that.
Yeah. It's
wasteful, nevertheless. It's unnecessarily suffering, nevertheless. So I think there will be a response. Like you said, there have been voices speaking out, especially on alternative media, of how to respond to excess porn, excess sex, excess social media, excess sugar and bad diets. And the response is to intentionally introduce scarcity. And hopefully that will take off.
I have to
smile on your face.
Bring this up because artificially introduced scarcity is something that we see coming down from those who suppose they are at the top of the pecking order, like the WEF, Klaus Schwab, these cabals up in the heights saying we're going to with climate crisis, we're going to introduce scarcity. We're going to put carbon emissions. We're going to give you a social credit score. If you burn too much carbon, then you won't be able to buy food, and because we're going to regulate it. And they're thinking more. It seems like they're thinking more in terms of the planet rather than the individual, right? You'll own nothing and be happy. Well, there's this weird. You're triggering me because like the artificially introduced scarcity. If you don't do it for yourself, somebody else is going to do it for you. Or if you're so reliant on these systems of prosperity and the people who gain control of them begin to push the levers, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing for them to watch your back and tell you what you can and can't eat.
I think what I'm referring to is not necessarily this guilt-induced encouragement to introduce scarcity. That's what I'm referring to. I'm referring to a realization that because of this excess, we have diseases of excess. And for your own good, you need to reduce some of the exposure to what is excessive. I think what they are doing is they're really exploiting the conscience of the West to introduce totalitarianism or their dictatorship. And that is very smart of them to do that, because that is the weakness of the West, is our conscience. I just hope that people see through that soon enough. That's different from what we are talking about.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about in introducing artificially or intentionally introducing restrictions or scarcity is for self-enhancement. What they're doing is introducing artificial Scarcity, not necessarily for self-enhancement. That will really debilitate societal growth.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a bit of a nuanced difference between the two.
Yeah. I just had to exploit that.
Gotcha, yeah. But these people are good with that. Hey, they're very, very good. They take what is socially regarded as honorable and dignified, and they smuggle something perverse in along with it. They use hard-earned values built over centuries as a vector to smuggle in what is perverse.
Huh.
And we know that with concepts like diversity or plurality or tolerance or, the usual stuff, anti-racism. It's so strange. Sometimes when I listen to even some psychoanalysts speaking about societal stuff, and they say, we fully support the idea of anti-racism. Like, oh, which anti-racism are you referring to? You can't be that naive. You've got to know that there are two types of anti-racism. The anti-racism that says what it is, we're opposed to racism. I think it's this perverse, corrupt concept of dystopian anti-racism doctrine. Please don't tell me you're referring to that too. Please don't tell me you're not aware of that type of anti-racism. So,
you mentioned earlier when you were discussing Winnicott about attachment styles with the mother or detachment styles, and going through that process of development and having the Goldilocks mom, just right, not too soft, not too hard. And you mentioned this term called guilt. And I want to explore that with you. I'm going to tell a brief story about when I was at the Evergreen State College and I was taking one of these DEI trainings before I knew that's what it was. It was just like this really creepy indoctrination training. And we were told to discuss our privilege, how we're privileged and how we're not privileged. And everybody would go around, in these small groups and say, well, I'm privileged in this way. I'm not privileged in that. Than this other way. So we can see that everybody has a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And we're all over the plat, but I just didn't want to play the game. And I was with the person who was giving the seminar, the leader of the seminar ended up in my group, and she was the DEI coordinator before it was called the DEI coordinator. They kept on changing their terms of this office of indoctrination over the course of my time at Evergreen. They keep on changing it now, Eventually they discovered this word called equity, which was just this great word. But before they discovered equity, it was like multicultural, and it was all these other kind of, buzzwords. Weird mishmash buzzwords, but it's just buzzwords all the way down. But she's like, well, why don't you think this way? I'm like, she's like, this is just a thought experiment, But I'm like, I don't think in terms of what I have and what I don't have. That's poison. That's poison to me. Like I spent all this time teaching kids not to think about, like how many crumbs does this guy get from the pie more than I, like that hair splitting. You have to get over that, or else you're focused on the pie and you lose out on life. Or you just eat the pie, you eat angry pie, because like you don't even enjoy the pie because you're angry. Or you have victory pie where you're not even tasting the pie because like I got more of the pie. And I realized later on when I was deprogramming myself by doing reporting on Evergreen and seeing where it went, and I knew it was going to go there, and they proved me kind of right intuitively, and then I went through and I had to talk about it. I realized that I resisted playing that game with discussing my privilege and my underprivilege, or the opposite of privilege, because I didn't want to hand them my guilt. Like I'm before God. Like God is my judge. God is my judge. I'm not going to hand over my guilt and my shame to other people, because then they can manipulate me. And I saw that especially with the white people. They would speak and they would go along with the anti-racist stuff, and they would constantly apologize, or they say like, there's this great book on this, and I'm sorry, it's a white guy that wrote this, but it's a really good book about this thing. Like they're always sorry. They're always mewling. And so when the event happened, they were completely susceptible to mind control. And like, they just became automatons, or just cyborgs, just getting, like you sit in the back, you go get water, like you're the white people, you're the servile class now. And so I saw that one of my resistances to that, to being caught up in that mind virus, is that I wouldn't give them my guilt. Something about my guilt is very, very personal to me. And I think that's a lever by which I'm controlled. And I need to feel guilty about the, the bum on the street, to help, to be incentivized to be a good person. I need a sense of guilt. And in order to restrain my own lusts and hungers, I need to have a sense of shame too. Like, this is a social regulatory mechanism that leads me to the path of a dignified life. So I'm just opening up that, because we like to run from guilt, but I think it's a very, very powerful thing, and we need to be aware of what it is.
Absolutely. I mean, guilt can build character. Guilt is such a helpful vector in embracing yourself and in encouraging yourself to be better, with your warts and all. It is such a valuable. It's such a valuable property in our psychology. And Freud wasn't that fond of guilt, wasn't that fond of shame either. So, but Melanie Klein came along, and she distinguished between condemnatory guilt, paranoid guilt, in other words, that could just condemn and destroy. There's no reparation and restitution from that, in that experience of guilt. And that is super ego type guilt. It's harsh. And then she distinguished that from reparatory guilt, where there's hope, where there is forgiveness and embrace. And that is what's lacking in this new discourse around race and privilege. And even when I grew up, it's so strange. We used to pray, thank you. How do we say that in Afrikaans? Thank you for all our privileges. Dank je vir al ons voorregte. Thank you for all our privileges. And it was said in a state of gratitude and of appreciation. We appreciated that we had privileges, we had advantages. And because of that, we can also be generous. And that is that is the secret to gratitude. People who are grateful are also generous because they have this bias. And the bias is that they have excess, they have too much, they have more than enough. And because of this experience of having too much, they tend to be rather generous.
Yeah.
A person who's envious lives in an internal state of poverty and impoverishment. That's why someone who's envious, even though they have a lot, they're still stingy and ungrateful and resentful. It's a state of mind. But again, it is interesting how this word, privilege, that a decade or two or three ago was used to induce a sense of gratitude and generosity, just pivoted into this discourse of resentment. So I wrote a few things down here as you were talking like that. Mm-hmm. And again, Melanie Klein elaborated a lot around envy versus gratitude. I can go into that a bit later. Mm-hmm. And induced shame, altruism. Okay, so let me do that then. So the formulation of envy. So let's go back to the infant. So the infant is very, very young. They're in a state of split where they can only appreciate things as all good or all bad. And when things are all bad, they have this persecutory guilt, this anxious distress that's just out to destroy them. And when mother appears, or when mother appears in good timing, there's the all good breast. And it provides in excess, and the baby just engulfs the breast. But as the baby grows up, he realizes that the bad mom and the good mom is actually the same person. And the aggression they had toward this mother was aggression towards the same mother that's also good. And that creates intense ambivalence. And with it comes a sense of intense guilt. And sometimes that guilt feels too overwhelming, and they need to defend against that guilt. And when the breast they previously destroyed then offers them milk, they cannot fully appreciate that milk, because that is the milk and that is the breast they earlier on used to resent when it came too late. And they realized that this is mother as excess. I am dependent on mother. Why can't I be the one being self-sufficient? And that is where the envy then starts, realizing that mom has something that baby desires. And in response to that, within the envious dynamic, we destroy or the baby destroys what mom has, so that neither of them have it.
What do you mean by destroy? What do you mean by destroy?
You see the aggression, you see the engulfing when the baby attacks that breast. You see that engulfing. And the lack of appreciation that even though they hate this breast, now they need to be dependent upon this breast, feeding them the milk they need. And this is inferred from infant observation, from our perspective. But when mom persists and when she does not retaliate, and when she forgives, and when baby notices, even though I wanted to destroy, and even though I defended against this condemnatory guilt, there is repair. The baby can more fully take in and appreciate the milk and the forgiveness with it. And that creates hope, and that creates gratitude. And with it, the sufficient mother gets internalized. With it, the gratitude, and with it, the sense of generosity. When that does not happen, the baby goes through life unthankful, resistant, distant, devaluing, defensive, narcissistic, destructive. And the guilt, the condemnatory guilt that they could not carry, they project into the other. That is why envious people, resentful people, projects guilt into the other, and others identify with that guilt. That's called projective identification. When you catch the thing, they project into you, and that becomes problematic.
Could you give an example of that?
I will do that now. Am I too dark? I can't see myself.
Oh, that's good.
Much better? Okay. An example of this. So, someone who's perpetually victimized, always empathic, always super compassionate, runs the risk of having disowned their own aggression. So what do? They seek out companions who tend to be sadistic, so that they project their own internal sadism or their own aggression into the other. Someone who's prone to sadism and aggression might identify with that which the victim projected into them. And a sadomasochistic relationship might start to develop. And that is why we find things like Stockholm Syndrome, where there's so much identification with a perpetrator that the eternally compassionate victim engages in this strange symbiotic relationship with the punisher on the other hand, and that almost keeps that relationship alive. Or someone who's envious, who's resentful, what are they trying to do? They try to tell you that their suffering has a source, and somehow you're part of the reason for their suffering. What do they induce in you? They induce guilt in you so that you can do something about their suffering. The trick is you can stand on your head until the cows come home. You will never provide sufficient sustenance, reparations, feeding to the envious victim, such that they would become satisfied. And that is this whole trick around wokeism. You should never catch the guilt, no matter what. Don't catch that guilt. It is sadistic, it is envious. And they can play the virtue card. They can abuse, like I said, values and use values that have been built over centuries against you. Don't fall for it. You are being duped. They're smuggling in their own perverse agendas, unconscious agendas to catch you out with. Don't do it. And isn't it interesting that as with this primitive, primal, destructive envy that we see in seriously disordered individuals, we see exactly the same with this whole woke movement, and that no reparation is ever possible. It is captured in their ideology. Mm-hmm. The other day I posted something on Twitter and I said, there are quite a few philosophies in the world that are actually just philosophical sophistications of very primal defenses or very primal operations. Marxism and even the modern forms, the woke form of Marxism, is a philosophical sophistication of deep, destructive, primal envy. The idea around queer theory is a philosophical sophistication of deep, engulfing perversion. I wanted another adjective. What's the word? You get the impression. That is to indulging perversion. It is just sophistication of deep primal defenses, and we have quite a few around. I would say Christianity is a theophilosophical sophistication of reparative guilt. So, yeah.
Reparative guilt brought to the highest possible station, right? It's like
you live by
guilt
principles.
with existence by itself,
with existence
not just
in society with yourself.
History.
Right. It's a set of values that have been built around our awareness of our proclivity to do what is wrong, that sometimes we damage not only ourselves but also others, but that there is hope to repair.
And just to restate what you're doing, or what you were talking about with this observation of the baby and the breast, and the narrative that's developed around just watching this, mommy, where are you? Why did you leave me? You come back, and now you're like, you are the source of my suffering. And then in that little moment, like, well, I need you, but I hate you. And so there's maybe this like a bite down on that. And then the mother sustains a sense of...
And talks and explains, I understand.
And
it must have been very difficult. Yeah. And
then the baby feels a sense
guilty because I just now
like,
bit mom. Yes.
I hurt her. Yeah.
I hurt her. But there's forgiveness. That's okay, my baby. It's okay. You don't have to feel guilty. Mommy is here.
I understand.
Mommy's here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I
understand. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So, because earlier in the conversation, we were talking about a society that's over-mothering.
Yeah.
And, there was something else. This is kind of, I think it's related, but my brain's just going all over the place because of what we're talking about. We're talking about really primal things, but I was just thinking about how in our society, in America, what we've decided was the place where we could escape from self-restraint into pure tolerance of anything was this month. Well, it started as a day and then a week weekend, and then a week, and then a month, and then a season of pride. And pride became this bucket.
Celebration of indecency.
Lust, you see gluttony, you see lust in there, you see greed, because all the corporations go there too. It's like this complete bacchanalia. Like we're just like, and it's through it. It's intimately linked somehow to sexuality. It was sexuality that provided cover for all these things to go, and it's like sexuality linked to pride, and sexuality was linked to shame and to guilt and to privacy, right? It wasn't just like,
yes.
And trying to like be okay with whoever you are, whatever you're into, was kind of one way of dealing with that. Privately, but then it just spilled out into the whole, where we just did. And it's also, there's one little thing where you see, well, why are white people not where's white pride? Because we're not supposed to have white pride, but you see that in the rainbow. It's hidden in the rainbow. It's like this European, like look at how rich we are as a country, that we can just give ourselves over to celebration of complete wastrel. Just we can just spend and spend.
Yes,
and spend.
Wasteful.
It's because
that's it.
It's because we're so prosperous as liberal in our liberal.
Yes.
Corner of the world.
Again, the bias, the idea that society is like this mother that has an excess that's inexhaustible in the milk that she provides. No society can survive this. No society. It's too bad. And there is this shifting of goalposts all the time, like you said. I mean, in the 70s, when there were pride parades, etc., you still see the decency. People are still proud. There's respect. There's not this indulgence and this ugly and this shamelessness and this indecency. I mean, some of the videos I saw, there were even nudists parading around. Some of them even having semi-hard-ons in front of children, twerking in front of children. There's no shame. There's no restraint. That is a depiction of Herbert Marcuse's unrepressed society, Herbert Marcuse's utopia. That should give us an idea of what it must look like. There's no shame. And no society can survive that.
It
is super wasteful. Sorry, yeah?
No, you look at people asking, how do we walk this back? And, there's this whole talk about a pendulum swinging or some sort of backlash that might or might not, but a lot of people don't want a backlash. They don't want like an authoritarian hard right. We're going to clean everything up. We're going to batten everything down. We're going to enforce conformity to a very particular rule. We're going to march step through this. We're going to clean up the streets. And on one level, that might be what cleans it up. But the cost of that is the loss of personal conscience and personal liberty. No,
that's not the solution.
So I don't think this is necessarily the centrist point of view or the classical liberal point of view, but there's a psychological and a spiritual or even theological, or like a marriage of psychology and theology about values and meaning and where they come from and what they serve. How does the individual interact with society, and how is society incentivizing through tolerance and all this other great language that's wrapped in virtue, the destruction and the wasting of the individual and itself? And how does society, or how do people within society aright the individual in a right society where there is a demand, but not too much of a demand, right? There's a demand for conformity to a certain set of values, but not too much.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier about the father and the paternal function. I just had a thought there now. So yes, one of the dangers of this Marcusean world is the compensatory backlash or the overcorrection towards the far right, towards a totalitarian regime. It is a danger. Just because we can't imagine it doesn't mean it's not possible. It is possible. Oh yes, this is what I wanted to say. So the problem we're sitting with is this, that even with people's lifestyles, when they encounter the consequences of their lifestyles, they don't see it as a consequence of their lifestyles. They see it as environmental failure. It's the strangest thing, again. And I want to use this as an example. And like I said, I'm a psychologist, and I observe people, and I listen to what they say. And that gives me insight into how they think. I have attended a funeral of someone who died of a venereal disease. And when I see people's response to that tragedy, and when I listen to how they speak, it is almost as if the existence of such a disease was the injustice. It wasn't because of lapses in judgment, bad behavioral choices that led to a person acquiring that disease that eventually led to their dying. And this is the problem with the zeitgeist we find ourselves in, and the specific brand of Marxism we're dealing with. That bad consequences never come from the person themselves. It's always from the society failing them. That is how infantilizing it is. And society will continue doing that because it's so easy. It is the envious state. Society failed me. I am the victim, remember. I am idealized. I can't do anything wrong. I couldn't tolerate imagining all this responsibility and accountability over my behavior, over my failures, because I'm too narcissistic. It's got to be someone else's fault. The thing is, they will run into reality whether they like it or not. The paternal function will be there. Restriction, consequence, bad consequence will be there. Some will be slow learners. Some won't learn at all. Others will. Look, the mob may be stupid, and many times humans have proven themselves to not always be that intelligent, but we are not that stupid. Many of us will realize that these are consequences to your own behavior, to living according to values that are not conducive to flourishing. We need to do something about it. Societies will start, or communities will start collapsing. Some communities will be turned into what I've heard Californian cities are being turned into. And some South African towns and cities are being turned, and neighborhoods are being turned into. Because certain things just shouldn't be tolerated. And hopefully, there will be a groundswell of sufficiently cohesive communities and eventually a society that will communicate a better set of values. A set of values that has a better cause and effect narrative. A set of values that is rooted in history. A set of values that is sufficiently saturated in gratitude and appreciation, sufficient occasion of celebration, of expressing that gratitude, such that people would find that society, those communities, more appealing than the indecent, perverse, ugly we see among the woke.
There's There's a great example of what you're talking about these values that were created over generations and then being used to smuggle in corruption at that funeral, where I could see it, where that adage or that phrase, the Christian phrase, hate the sin, love the sinner, has become hate the consequence, excuse the
behavior,
excuse the chooser, I guess, or something. Yeah, excuse the behavior, hate the consequence. It's the same formula, but it just loses track of.
It's like compassion,
the good and the true.
It's
and
like
the beautiful.
compassion,
Yeah,
unbridled compassion. What's unbridled compassion? It's not compassionate at all. You imagine that you're compassionate. In your fantasy, you're being compassionate, because in your fantasy, you're enjoying a utopia where there are no consequences to your behaviors, where all suffering is just bad and unfair. All restriction is just unfair. It's a deprivation of what you're entitled to. That's in fantasy. That's compassion in fantasy. In reality, that's not compassion. That's the perpetuation of suffering because of a refusal to integrate reality around you. A narcissistic and envious refusal to do that.
Yeah.
Remember I said earlier, oh no, I forgot it again. No, that's fine. So structure is necessary, and to be consistent in what you propose is also necessary. And I think alternative media has a wonderful opportunity to do just that. I recently listened to a very, very good podcast where a person said, in those countries where great instability and bloody revolution took place, 3 professions were central in bringing those about. And they were lawyers, academia, and media. Lawyers, academia, and media. Obviously politicians too, but I mean, politicians enact laws, and lawyers
or just media lawyers.
Yeah, it's true. And lawyers then impose those corrupt laws. And it is interesting to see that there is already alternative media being created in the West. So there's no longer monopoly on information distribution. The only thing that needs to be created would have to be parallel, alternative, educational and academic institutions. In terms of lawyers, that is just fine. At least the dissemination of information and the inculcation of information, from academic institutions, will produce a larger chunk of society that will have a say around legislation. And hopefully that will eventually bring a turn in the tide. It's already happening in Britain, but anyway. Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is that what you're proposing is that through better forms of media, people will be connected or woken or come together or be incentivized or be given hope that alternative institutions are possible. Yes. And then the people who are able to create those institutions will begin to create them. And then the people who want to go to them will find them. And the media plays the role of creating the narrative of possibility. Yeah. And then through that, over time, then you have a groundswell of smart people, and through non-fascistic or non-direct conflict means, you will have an alternative elite. You'll have a better hill to die on, which doesn't really involve any bloody revolution.
This isn't utopia, but I think it's better. We will still have to deal with the tragic triad of guilt, pain, and death, and the sophisticated variants under those categories. Just keep in mind, I said that reality will serve as the paternal function to many of these who are committed to disavow reality. And that means that many of those institutions will not survive. By necessity, they will not survive. It's not conducive to flourishing. And hopefully they leave sufficient infrastructure behind so that those who have sufficient reality contact will then move in and repair what is left to be repaired and resurrect what still could be resurrected. But I don't think fighting or challenging or trying to reform those institutions from the inside out will be possible. Not when you're dealing with envy. Look, you will provide them to their heart's delight with enough to destroy. So if people want to be, if people want to be masochistic and really commit to trying to change things around from the inside out, well, waste your time, waste your money. They will love what you do.
Because you're saying they're saying that there is a psychologically toxic program
Absolutely.
at work that is unable to be stymied or stopped within, let's just say, academia, colleges of education, maybe education itself. Maybe when we talk about the United States, the federal government, like the deep state, all that stuff, there's no reforming. There's chopping off the head and reformulating. There's disbanding and recreating, or there's creating something parallel. It's like it's like the difference between going to counseling and getting a divorce. Like, you don't think counseling, like you can go in there and reform the marriage.
Well, of course, it depends on the actual dynamics within that marriage. But in certain relationships, certain things have been committed that have been deal-breaking issues. And within woke society, several deal-breaking issues have been committed, or deal-breaking mistakes have been committed. The mutilation of children is one of those. The deliberate disruption of society around racial lines, the instigation of tribalism, is one of those as well. Is repair possible? I think the society that we're talking about, this alternative emerging communities and society, has to have will have to have a discussion around repair, around reconciliation. I don't think condemnatory guilt will adequately solve societal ills. There's got to be a discussion around reparation too. But I think by virtue of what these people have already committed, there is such an indictment upon them already that I don't think that they would even risk entering a negotiation or a possibility of repair knowing what they did. Some of them have committed the lobotomy scandal of the 21st century. And the victims aren't adults, even vulnerable adults. The victims are children. They will double down. They're already doubling down. So yeah, complex issues.
But no condemnation. But at the same time, I mean, you're not advocating for a millstone, and you're not advocating for the pillory. You think that reality will provide the...
Yeah. That becomes a slippery slope. As soon as we become too punitive, that becomes a slippery slope.
Yeah.
How this will play out in reality, how the nuance will be reached, where there's sufficient accountability, but not excessive punishment. I don't know how that will look. But as time goes by and as society wakes up, and I think things are starting to happen slowly, but surely things are starting to happen. It's going to be slow, but as things progress, these discussions will have to be had.
I think that's I want to get back. I wanted to bring the conversation back around to South Africa. Just where we started, and I asked you, is this sustainable? And you mentioned, I don't know without some sort of group action. I don't know without some sort of really tough decisions. At some point, I mean, South Africa is different than the United States. I mean, California, like, or whatever, San Francisco is like one little pocket, and people can move away from there. There's plenty of land out here. South Africa, like the structure that exists there governmentally and just the infrastructure itself doesn't seem to have much left in it. And once that goes, then how are people going to band together, and what lines are they going to draw? And then what kind of, is it going to split up? Like, are people going to divide around racial lines? I mean, if they're singing "Kill the Boyer," are the Boyers going to have to flee, or actually, pardon me, are they going to have to flee? Are they going to have to stand their ground? What are they going to, what are they going to do? Like,
they won't. They all of them can't flee. It's just not possible. It's not possible for all of them to flee. Many of them don't want to flee because they feel, and that is the right to feel that way, that they're entitled to the land they inherited. So I think there will be a separation of sorts taking place again. I don't think, especially around the dominant narrative that's taking place in South Africa, it will be difficult to have confidence in political parties that they will prevent this type of tribalism to escalate. It's just been escalating like it's nobody's business, and it is. I'm stunned by the tolerance of the singing of that song. And it's so interesting. I not really followed the court case that was brought against that leader. It was so interesting to hear that what the defense was. And again, as someone who studies psychology and mass psychology, it was interesting to hear how the defense that actually led to the court verdict that it was not a commission of hate speech, in psychological terms, was precisely what we see happened in Rwanda and in Kosovo before genocides broke out. And that was this resurrection of what they call, Vamik Volkan calls it, a chosen trauma, where they latch on to historical trauma, they resurrect that historical trauma, they enact protest against that historical trauma, but they project it onto those available now. So they might not. So the recipients of their violence may not be the same people that lived decades ago who actually committed these atrocities, but the new victims might be descendants, or it might just be reminders of the actual perpetrators in the past. And then by enacting this historical drama, they engage in a type of a revenge ritual. And that is precisely what ought to be condemned as dangerous. That is precisely what led to so many genocides in the past. And yet this was the argument that exonerated this leader. That is just a struggle song. It's not just a struggle song. It's precisely because it's a struggle song and it involves an enemy. And there is a clear representation of that enemy living today. And he uses the language, so many other occasions, of slitting the throat of so-called whiteness, etc. I mean, they know exactly what they were doing. And interestingly enough, when you follow the comments of his followers on Twitter, you can see that the way that song registered with them was as an incitement to violence and revenge. So, the outcome, with the rate of deterioration and the momentum of deterioration, I don't think reconciliation along racial lines will come anytime soon. I think it is at its lowest in decades. I think separation in terms of cultural hubs will be necessary. It is protected under the Constitution. And hopefully some international support and awareness to apply some international pressure. Maybe that will help.
Yeah. Yeah, the New York Times has got your back.
I don't think so.
They want to turn down the heat, right?
I don't think so. Not the New York Times. No, they're still in denial. Yeah. Crazy times. Crazy times.
Yeah. So you run the podcast for Critical Therapy Antidote.
Me and Christine.
Can you give you and Christine Stephen? Okay. Want to plug that, and then also what else you're working on? Are you writing a great big book about what we've been talking about?
No, not yet. So, yes, the CTA podcast. It is on Spotify and on YouTube. We discuss what you and I have been discussing today, and we discuss it from various perspectives. Because we're both mental health practitioners, myself a clinical psychologist and Christine a marriage and family therapist, the flavor of our discussions are more psychological. We try to present it in as accessible language as possible. Christine helps a lot with that, because I tend to veer off that track a bit. But it's meant for the public. It is also meant for mental health practitioners themselves. There has been a void in terms of organizations, in terms of social arrangements where mental health practitioners can come together and discuss these concerns. So many just notice how things are going awry, but they have no way of discussing it, no way of finding like-minded people. And I think the CTA, the Critical Therapy Antidote, our website is criticaltherapyantidote.org. And there we post also our podcasts, articles that we write. We have several contributors. And those who would like to join are more than welcome. We only meet once a month. We have a speaker discussion. It's good to see everybody around. It's good to hear what everybody is working on. We also have a peer support group that we run from time to time, where we can just process our own experiences in society, in practice, and the like. It's a very, very helpful platform.
And specifically in the wake of what is called critical social justice or wokeness, and its infiltration and imposition on the counseling profession, broadly speaking, all the different. Yeah.
So, like you said, critical social justice in terms of its theoretical formulation, how it's applied, how it plays out in terms of race and sex and gender identity and transgenderism and treatment, how therapy is supposed to be done, as opposed to what they're proposing it should be done. So yes, there's a lot to cover. There's really a lot to cover.
And what about your book?
I'm not writing about it.
You're a man of a certain age. You have to have a book.
I know.
You have to.
Let me complete my adjustment moving to Ireland, and I will start working on it.
Oh, okay. And your beekeeping? Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
I'm still running a practice as well. We need to keep the household afloat. So it's quite a lot. It's quite a lot to balance, but somehow we manage.
Well, thank you so much for giving me your time and let me pick your brain. And I mean, it felt like I want to have you on again, or maybe have you and Christine or a number of other people on again, because I really like there's a political way of looking at this. There's a theoretical, philosophical way of looking at this. And there's also a psychological way of looking at this, because there are dynamics. All these politics are running on the engine of the human being and the human psychology, and understanding what healthy human beings, well-adjusted, what it is to be well-adjusted as an individual, and what it is to be well-adjusted as a society, it's a holistic approach to seeing and evaluating whether any given theory is going to be a manifestation of our better natures or our demonic natures. And psychology has the tools to examine that.
Thank you very much. It was lovely. My goodness. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome.